Chapter 22 of Tarzan Triumphant by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22 By a Lonely Pool. Night had fallen, and Tarzan of the Apes, leading Lady Barbara Collis and Lafayette Smith from the valley of the land of Midian, did not see the spoor of Jezebel and the gunner. His two charges were upon the verge of exhaustion, but the ape-man led them on through the night in accordance with a plan he had decided upon. He knew that there were two more whites missing, Jezebel and Danny Patrick, and he wanted to get Lady Barbara and Smith to a place of safety that he might be free to pursue his search for these others. To Lady Barbara and Smith the journey seemed interminable, yet they made no complaint, for the ape-man had explained the purpose of this forced march to them, and they were even more anxious than he concerning the fate of their friends. Smith supported the girl as best he could, but his own strength was almost spent, and sometimes his desire to assist her tended more to impede than to aid her. Finally she stumbled and fell, and when Tarzan, striding in advance, heard and returned to them, he found Smith vainly endeavoring to lift Lady Barbara. This was the first intimation the ape-man had received that his charges were upon the verge of exhaustion, for neither had voiced a single complaint. And when he realized it, he lifted Lady Barbara in his arms and carried her, while Smith, relieved at least of further anxiety concerning her, was able to keep going, though he moved like an automaton, apparently without conscious volition. Nor may his state be wondered at, when one considers what he had passed through during the preceding 3 days. With Lady Barbara, he marveled at the strength and endurance of the ape-man, which, because of his own weakened state, seemed unbelievable even as he witnessed it. "It is not much farther," said Tarzan, guessing that the man needed encouragement. "You are sure the hunter you told us of has not moved his camp?" asked Lady Barbara. "He was there day before yesterday," replied the ape-man. "I think we shall find him there tonight." "He will take us in?" asked Smith. "Certainly, just as you would, under similar circumstances, take in anyone who needed assistance," replied the Lord of the Jungle. "He is an Englishman," he added, as though that fact in itself were a sufficient answer to their doubts. They were in a dense forest now, following an ancient game trail, and presently they saw lights flickering ahead. "That must be the camp," exclaimed Lady Barbara. "Yes," replied Tarzan, and a moment later he called out in a native dialect. Instantly came an answering voice, and a moment later Tarzan halted upon the edge of the camp just outside the circle of beast fires. Several askaris were on guard, and with them Tarzan conversed for a few moments. Then he advanced and lowered Lady Barbara to her feet. "I have told them not to disturb their bwana," the ape-man explained. "There is another tent that Lady Barbara may occupy, and the headman will arrange to have a shelter thrown up for Smith. You will be perfectly safe here. The men tell me their bwana is Lord Passmore. He will doubtless arrange to get you out to Railhead. In the meantime, I shall try to locate your friends." That was all. The ape-man turned and melted into the black night before they could voice any thanks. "Why, he's gone!" exclaimed the girl. "I didn't even thank him." "I thought he would remain here until morning," said Smith. "He must be tired." "He seems tireless," replied Lady Barbara. "He is a superman, if ever there was one." "Come," said the headman. "Your tent is over here. The boys are arranging a shelter for the bwana." "Good night, Mr. Smith," said the girl. "I hope you sleep well." "Good night, Lady Barbara," replied Smith. "I hope we wake up sometime." And as they prepared for this welcome rest, Stallbush and Jezebel were riding through the night, the man completely confused and lost. Toward morning they drew rein at the edge of a great forest, after riding in wide circles during the greater part of the night. Stallbush was almost exhausted, and Jezebel was but little better off, but she had youth and health to give her the reserve strength that the man had undermined and wasted in dissipation. "I've got to get some sleep," he said, dismounting. Jezebel needed no invitation to slip from her saddle, for she was stiff and sore from this unusual experience. Stallbutch led the animals inside the forest and tied them to a tree. Then he threw himself upon the ground and was almost immediately asleep. Jezebel sat in silence, listening to the regular breathing of the man. Now would be the time to escape, she thought. She rose quietly to her feet. How dark it was! Perhaps it would be better to wait until it became light enough to see. She was sure the man would sleep a long time, for it was evident that he was very tired. She sat down again, listening to the noises of the jungle. They frightened her. Yes, she would wait until it was light. Then she would untie the horses, ride one and lead the other away so that the man could not pursue her. Slowly the minutes crept by. The sky became lighter in the east over the distant mountains. The horses became restless. She noticed that they stood with ears pricked up and that they looked deeper into the jungle and trembled. Suddenly there was the sound of crashing in the underbrush. The horses snorted and surged back upon their ropes, both of which broke. The noise awakened Stallbutch, who sat up just as the two terrified animals wheeled and bolted. An instant later, a lion leapt past the girl and the man in pursuit of the two fleeing horses. Stallbutch sprang to his feet, his rifle in his hands. "God!" he exclaimed, "this is no place to sleep," and Jezebel's opportunity had passed. The sun was topping the eastern mountains. The day had come. Soon the searchers would be a horse. Now that he was afoot, Stallbutch knew that he must not loiter. However, they must eat, or they would have no strength to proceed, and only by his rifle could they eat. "Climb into that tree, little one," he said to Jezebel. "You will be safe there while I go and shoot something for our breakfast. Watch for the lion. If you see him returning this way, shout a warning. I am going further into the forest to look for game." Jezebel climbed into a tree, and Stallbutch departed upon the hunt for breakfast. The girl watched for the lion, hoping it would return, for she had determined that she would give no warning to the man if it did. She was afraid of the Russian because of things he had said to her during that long night ride. Much that he had said she had not understood at all, but she understood enough to know that he was a bad man. But the lion did not return, and presently Jezebel dozed and nearly fell out of the tree. Stallbutch, hunting in the forest, found a waterhole not far from where he had left Jezebel, and here he hid behind bushes waiting for some animal to come down to drink. Nor had he long to wait before he saw a creature appearing suddenly upon the opposite side of the pool. So quietly had it come that the Russian had not dreamed that a creature stirred within a mile of his post. The most surprising feature of the occurrence, however, was that the animal thus suddenly to step into view was the man. Stallbutch's evil eyes narrowed. It was the man he had traveled all the way from Moscow to kill. What an opportunity! Fate was indeed kind to him. He would fulfill his mission without danger to himself, and then he would escape with the girl, that wondrous girl. Stallbutch had never seen so beautiful a woman in his life, and now he was to possess her. She was to be his. But first he must attend to the business of the moment. What a pleasant business it was, too. He raised his rifle very cautiously and aimed. Tarzan had halted and turned his head to one side. He could not see the rifle barrel of his enemy because of the bush behind which Stallbutch hid, and the fact that his eyes were centered on something in another direction. The Russian realized that he was trembling, and he cursed himself under his breath. The nervous strain was too great. He tensed his muscles in an effort to hold his hands firm and the rifle steady and immovable upon the target. The front sight of the rifle was describing a tiny circle instead of remaining fixed upon that great chest which offered such a splendid target. But he must fire. The man would not stand there thus forever. The thought hurried Stallbutch, and as the sight passed again across the body of the ape-man, the Russian squeezed the trigger. At the sound of the shot, Jezebel's eyes snapped open. "Perhaps the lion returned," she soliloquized. "Or maybe the man has found food. If it were the lion, I hope he missed it." Also, as the rifle spoke, the target leapt into the air, seizing a low-hung branch, and disappeared amidst the foliage of the trees above. Stallbuch had missed. He should have relaxed his muscles rather than tensed them. The Russian was terrified. He felt as must one who stands upon the drop with the noose already about his neck. He turned and fled. His cunning mind suggested that he had better not return where the girl was. She was already lost to him, for he could not be burdened with her now in this flight, upon the success of which hung his very life. Accordingly, he ran toward the south. As he rushed headlong through the forest, he was already out of breath when he felt a sudden sickening pain in his arm, and at the same instant saw the feathered tip of an arrow waving beside him as he ran. The shaft had pierced his forearm, its tip projecting from the opposite side. Sick with terror, Stallbuch increased his speed. Somewhere above him was his nemesis, whom he could neither see nor hear. It was as though a ghostly assassin pursued him on silent wings. Again an arrow struck him, sinking deep into the triceps of his other arm. With a scream of pain and horror, Stallbuch halted, and dropping upon his knees, raised his hands in supplication. "Spare me!" he cried. "Spare me! I have never wronged you. If you will spare—" An arrow, speeding straight, drove through the Russian's throat. He screamed and clutched at the missile and fell forward on his face. Jezebel, listening in the tree, heard the agonized shriek of the stricken man, and she shuddered. "The lion got him," she whispered. "He was wicked. It is the will of Jehovah." Tarzan of the Apes dropped lightly from a tree and warily approached the dying man. Stallbuch, writhing in agony and terror, rolled over on his side. He saw the ape-man approaching, his bow and arrow ready in his hand, and dying, reached for the revolver at his hip to complete the work that he had come so far to achieve and for which he was to give his life. No more had his hand reached the grip of his weapon than the Lord of the Jungle loosed another shaft that drove deep through the chest of the Russian, deep through his heart. Without a sound, Leon Stallbuch collapsed, and a moment later there rang through the jungle the fierce, uncanny victory cry of the bull ape. As the savage notes reverberated through the forest, Jezebel slid to the ground and fled in terror. She knew not where nor to what fate her fleeing feet led her. She was obsessed by but a single idea: to escape from the terrors of that lonely spot. End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Tarzan Triumphant by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Captured. With the coming of day, the gunner found himself near a forest. He had heard no sound of horses all during the night, and now that day had come and he could see to a distance, he scanned the landscape for some sign of Stallbuch and Jezebel, but without success. "Geez," he muttered, "there ain't no use. I gotta rest. The poor little kid. If I only knew where the rat took her, but I don't, and I gotta rest." He surveyed the forest. "That looks like a swell hideout. I'll lay up there and grab off a little sleep. Geez, I'm all in." As he walked toward the forest, his attention was attracted to something moving a couple of miles to the north of him. He stopped short and looked more closely as two horses, racing from the forest, dashed madly toward the foothills, pursued by a lion. "Geez," exclaimed the gunner, "those must be their horses. What if the lion got her?" Instantly his fatigue was forgotten, and he started at a run toward the north. But he could not keep the pace up for long, and soon he was walking again, his brain a turmoil of conjecture and apprehension. He saw the lion give up the chase and turn away almost immediately, cutting up the slope in a northeasterly direction. The gunner was glad to see him go, not for his own sake so much as for Jezebel, whom he reasoned the lion might not have killed after all. There was a possibility, he thought, that she might have had time to climb a tree. Otherwise, he was positive the lion must have killed her. His knowledge of lions was slight. In common with most people, he believed that lions wandered about killing everything so unfortunate as to fall into their pathways, unless they were bluffed out as he had bluffed the panther the day before. But, of course, he reasoned, Jezebel wouldn't have been able to bluff a lion. He was walking close to the edge of the forest, making the best time that he could, when he heard a shot in the distance. It was the report of Stallbuch's rifle as he fired at Tarzan. The gunner tried to increase his speed. There was too much doing there where he thought Jezebel might be to permit of loafing, but he was too exhausted to move rapidly. Then, a few minutes later, the Russian scream of agony was wafted to his ears, and again he was goaded on. This was followed by the uncanny cry of the ape-man, which for some reason Danny did not recognize, though he had heard it twice before. Perhaps the distance and the intervening trees muffled and changed it. On he plodded, trying occasionally to run, but his overtaxed muscles had reached their limit, and he had to give up the attempt, for already he was staggering and stumbling even at a walk. "I ain't no good," he muttered. "Nothing but a lousy punk. Here's a guy beating it with my girl, and I ain't even got the guts to work my dogs. Geez, I'm a flop." A little farther on, he entered the forest so that he could approach the spot where he had seen the horses emerge without being seen if Stallbuch was still there. Suddenly he stopped. Something was crashing through the brush toward him. He recalled the lion and drew his pocket-knife. Then he hid behind a bush and waited. Nor did he have long to wait before the author of the disturbance broke into view. "Jezebel!" he cried, stepping into her path. His voice trembled with emotion. With a startled scream, the girl halted, and then she recognized him. "Danny!" It was the last straw. Her overwrought nerves went to pieces, and she sank to the ground, sobbing hysterically. The gunner took a step or two toward her. He staggered, his knees gave beneath him, and he sat down heavily a few yards from her. And then a strange thing happened. Tears welled to the eyes of Danny Gunner Patrick. He threw himself face down on the ground, and he too sobbed. For several minutes they lay there, and then Jezebel gained control of herself and sat up. "Oh, Danny," she cried, "are you hurt? Oh, your head! Don't die, Danny." He had quelled his emotion and was roughly wiping his eyes on his shirt-sleeve. "I ain't dying," he said, "but I oughta. Someone oughta bump me off. A great big stiff like me crying." "It's because you've been hurt, Danny," said Jezebel. "No, it ain't that. I've been hurt before, but I ain't bawled since I was a little kid when my mother died. It was something else, kid. I just blew up when I seen you and knew that you was okay. My nerves went bluey, just like that." He snapped his fingers. "You see," he added hesitantly, "I guess I like you an awful lot, kid." "I like you, Danny," she told him. "You're top hole." "I'm what? What does that mean?" "I don't know," Jezebel admitted. "It's English, and you don't understand English, do you?" He crawled over closer to her and took her hand in his. "Geez," he said, "I thought I wasn't never going to see you again." "Say," he burst out violently, "did that bum hurt you any, kid?" "The man who took me away from the black men in the village, you mean?" "Yes." "No, Danny. After he killed his friend, we rode all night. He was afraid the black men would catch him." "What became of the rat? How did you make your getaway?" She told him all that she knew, but they were unable to account for the sounds both had heard or to guess whether or not they had portended the death of Stallbuch. "I wouldn't be much good if he showed up again," said Danny. "I got to get my strength back some way." "You must rest," she told him. "I'll tell you what we'll do," he said. "We'll lay around here until we are rested up a bit. Then we'll beat it back up toward the hills where I know where there's water and something to eat. It ain't very good food," he added, "but it's better than none. Say, I got some of it in my pocket. We'll just have a feed now." He extracted some dirty scraps of half-burned pork from one of his pockets and surveyed them ruefully. "What is it?" asked Jezebel. "It's pig, kid," he explained. "It don't look so hot, does it? Well, it don't taste no better than it looks. But it's food, and that's what we're needin' bad right now. Here, hop to it." He extended a handful of the scraps toward her. "Shut your eyes and hold your nose, and it ain't so bad," he assured her. "Just imagine you're in the old College Inn." Jezebel smiled and took a piece of the meat. "United States is a funny language, isn't it, Danny?" "Why, I don't know, is it?" "Yes, I think so. Sometimes it sounds just like English, and yet I can't understand it at all." "That's because you ain't used to it," he told her. "But I'll learn you if you want me to. Do you?" "Oh, kid," replied Jezebel. "You're learning all right," said Danny admiringly. They lay in the growing heat of the new day and talked together of many things as they rested. Jezebel told him the story of the land of Midian, of her childhood, of the eventful coming of Lady Barbara and its strange effect upon her life, and Danny told her of Chicago, but there were many things in his own life that he did not tell her, things that, for the first time, he was ashamed of. And he wondered why he was ashamed. As they talked, Tarzan of the Apes quitted the forest and set out upon his search for them, going upward toward the hills, intending to start his search for their spoor at the mouth of the fissure. If he did not find it there, he would know that they were still in the valley. If he did find it, he would follow it until he located them. At the break of day, 100 shiftas rode out of their village. They had discovered the body of Capietro, and now they knew that the Russian had tricked them and fled, after killing their chief. They wanted the girl for ransom, and they wanted the life of Stawbuch. They had not ridden far when they met 2 riderless horses galloping back toward the village. The shiftas recognized them at once, and knowing that Stawbuch and the girl were now afoot, they anticipated little difficulty in overhauling them. The rolling foothills were cut by swales and canyons, so that at times the vision of the riders was limited. They had been following downward along the bottom of a shallow canyon for some time, where they could neither see to a great distance nor be seen. And then their leader turned his mount toward higher ground, and as he topped the summit of a low ridge, he saw a man approaching from the direction of the forest. Tarzan saw the shifta simultaneously and changed his direction obliquely to the left, breaking into a trot. He knew that if that lone rider signified a force of mounted shiftas, he would be no match for them, and guided by the instinct of the wild beast, he sought ground where the advantage would be with him, the rough, rocky ground leading to the cliffs, where no horse could follow him. With a yell to his followers, the shifted chieftain put spurs to his horse and rode at top speed to intercept the ape-man, and close behind him came his yelling savage horde. Tarzan quickly saw that he could not reach the cliffs ahead of them, but he maintained his steady, tireless trot that he might be that much nearer the goal when the attack came. Perhaps he could hold them off until he reached the sanctuary of the cliffs, but certainly he had no intention of giving up without exerting every effort to escape the unequal battle that must follow if they overtook him. With savage yells the shiftas approached, the loose cotton garments fluttering in the wind, the rifles waving above their heads. The chief rode in the lead, and when he was near enough, the ape-man, who had been casting occasional glances rearward across a brown shoulder, stopped, wheeled, and let an arrow drive at his foe. Then he was away again as the shaft sank into the breast of the shifta chieftain. With a scream the fellow rolled from his saddle, and for a moment the others drew rein, but only for a moment. Here was but a single enemy, poorly armed with primitive weapons. He was no real menace to mounted riflemen. Shouting their anger and their threats of vengeance, they spurred forward again in pursuit, But Tarzan had gained, and the rocky ground was not far away. Spreading in a great half-circle, the shifters sought to surround and head off their quarry, whose strategy they had guessed the moment that they had seen the course of his flight. Now another rider ventured too near, and for a brief instant Tarzan paused to loose another arrow. As the second enemy fell, mortally wounded, the ape-man continued his flight to the accompaniment of a rattle of musketry fire. But soon he was forced to halt again, as several of the horsemen passed him and cut off his line of retreat. The hail of slugs screaming past him or kicking up the dirt around him gave him slight concern, so traditionally poor was the marksmanship of these roving bands of robbers, illy equipped with ancient firearms, with which, because of habitual shortage of ammunition, they had little opportunity to practice. Now they pressed closer, in a rough circle of which he was the center, and firing across him from all sides, it seemed impossible that they should miss him. But miss him they did, though their bullets found targets among their own men and horses, until one, who had supplanted the slain chief, took command and ordered them to cease firing. Turning again in the direction of his flight, Tarzan tried to shoot his way through the cordon of horsemen shutting off his retreat, but though each arrow sped true to its mark, the yelling horde closed in upon him, until, his last shaft spent, he was the center of a closely milling mass of shrieking enemies. Shrilly above the pandemonium of battle rose the cries of the new leader. "Do not kill! Do not kill!" he screamed. "It is Tarzan of the Apes, and he is worth the ransom of a ras!" Suddenly a giant black threw himself from his horse full upon the lord of the jungle, but Tarzan seized the fellow and hurled him back among the horsemen. Yet closer and closer they pressed, and now several fell upon him from their saddles, bearing him down beneath the feet of the now frantic horses. Battling for life and liberty, the ape-man struggled against the overpowering odds that were being constantly augmented by new recruits, who hurled themselves from their mounts upon the growing pile that overwhelmed him. Once he managed to struggle to his feet, shaking most of his opponents from him, but they seized him about the legs and dragged him down again, and presently succeeded in slipping nooses about his wrists and ankles, thus effectually subduing him. Now that he was harmless, many of them reviled and struck him, but there were many others who lay upon the ground, some never to rise again. The shifters had captured the great Tarzan, but it had cost them dear. Now some of them rounded up the riderless horses, while others stripped the dead of their weapons, ammunition, and any other valuables the living coveted. Tarzan was raised to an empty saddle, where he was securely bound, and 4 men were detailed to conduct him and the horses of the dead to the village, the wounded accompanying them, while the main body of the blacks continued the search for Stallbush and Jezebel. End of Chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Tarzan Triumphant by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. The Long Night. The sun was high in the heavens when Lady Barbara, refreshed by her long undisturbed sleep, stepped from her tent in the camp of Lord Passmore. A smiling, handsome black boy came running toward her. "Breakfast soon be ready," he told her. "Lord Passmore very sorry. He have to go hunt." She asked after Lafayette Smith and was told that he had just awakened, nor was it long before he joined her, and soon they were breakfasting together. "If Jezebel and your friend were here," she said, "I should be very happy. I am praying that Tarzan finds them." "I am sure he will," Smith assured her, "though I am only worried about Jezebel. Danny can take care of himself." "Doesn't it seem heavenly to eat a meal again?" the girl remarked. "Do you know, it has been months since I've eaten anything that even vaguely approximated a civilized meal. Lord Passmore was fortunate to get such a cook for his safari. I had not such luck." "Have you noticed what splendid-looking fellows all his men are?" asked Smith. "They would make that aggregation of mine resemble fourth-rate roustabouts with hookworm and sleeping sickness." "There is another very noticeable thing about them," said Lady Barbara. "What is that?" "There is not a single piece of cast-off European finery among them. Their garb is native, pure and simple. And, while I'll have to admit there isn't much to it, it lends a dignity to them that European clothing would change to the absurd." "I quite agree with you," said Smith. "I wonder why I didn't get a safari like this." "Lord Passmore is evidently an African traveler and hunter of long experience. No amateur could hope to attract such men as these." "I shall hate to go back to my own camp if I stay here very long," said Smith, "but I suppose I'll have to. And that suggests another unpleasant feature of the change." "And what is that?" she asked. "I shan't see you any more," he said with a simple directness that vouched for the sincerity of his regret. The girl was silent for a moment, as though the suggestion had aroused a train of thought she had not before considered. "That is true, isn't it?" she remarked presently. "We shan't see each other any more, but not for always. I'm sure you'll stop and visit me in London. Isn't it odd what old friends we seem? And yet we only met 2 days ago. Or maybe it doesn't seem that way to you. You see, I was so long without seeing a human being of my own world that you were quite like a long-lost brother when you came along so unexpectedly." "I have the same feeling," he said, "as though I had known you forever, and—" he hesitated, "as though I could never get along without you in the future." He flushed a little as he spoke those last words. The girl looked up at him with a quick smile, a sympathetic, understanding smile. "It was nice of you to say that," she said. "Why, it sounded almost like a declaration," she added with a gay, friendly laugh. He reached across the little camp table and laid a hand upon hers. "Accept it as such," he said. "I'm not very good at saying things like that." "Let's not be serious," she begged. "Really, we scarcely know each other, after all." "I have known you always," he replied. "I think we were amoebas together before the first Cambrian dawn." "Now you've compromised me," she cried laughingly, "for I'm sure there were no chaperones way back there. I hope that you were a proper amoeba. You didn't kiss me, did you?" "Unfortunately for me, amoebas have no mouths," he said, "but I've been profiting by several million years of evolution just to remedy that defect." "Let's be amoebas again," she suggested. "No," he said, "for then I couldn't tell you that I—" He choked and flushed. "Please, please don't tell me," she cried. "We're such ripping friends. Don't spoil it." "Would it spoil it?" he asked. "I don't know. It might, I am afraid." "Can't I ever tell you?" he asked. "Perhaps, some day," she said. A sudden burst of distant rifle fire interrupted them. The blacks in the camp were instantly alert. Many of them sprang to their feet, and all were listening intently to the sounds of this mysterious engagement between armed men. The man and the girl heard the headman speaking to his fellows in some African dialect. His manner showed no excitement. His tones were low but clear. It was evident that he was issuing instructions. The men went quickly to their shelters, and a moment later Lady Barbara saw the peaceful camp transformed. Every man was armed now. As by magic, a modern rifle and a bandolier of cartridges were in the possession of each black. White feathered headdresses were being adjusted and war paint applied to glossy hides. Smith approached the headman. "What is the matter?" he asked. "Is something wrong?" "I do not know, Bwana," replied the black, "but we prepare." "Is there any danger?" continued the white. The headman straightened to his full, impressive height. "Are we not here?" he asked. Jezebel and the gunner were walking slowly in the direction of the distant water-hole and the cached boar-meat, following the bottom of a dip that was the mouth of a small canyon that led up into the hills. They were stiff and lame and very tired, and the wound on the gunner's head pained, but notwithstanding they were happy, as hand in hand they dragged their weary feet toward water and food. "Geez, kid," said Danny, "it sure is a funny world. Just think, if I hadn't met old Smithy on board that ship, me and you wouldn't never have met up. It all started from that." But then Danny knew nothing of Angustus the Ephesian. "I got a few grand salted away, kid, and when we get out of this mess, we'll go somewhere where nobody doesn't know me, and I'll start over again. Get myself a garage or a filling station, and we'll have a little flat. Geez, it's going to be great showing you things. You don't know what you ain't seen. Movies and railroads and boats. Geez, you ain't seen nothing, and nobody ain't going to show you nothing, only me." "Yes, Danny," said Jezebel, "it's going to be ripping," and she squeezed his hand. Just then they were startled by the sound of rifle fire ahead. "What was that?" asked Jezebel. "It sounded like the Valentine massacre," said Danny. "But I guess it's them tough smokes from the village. We better hide, kid." He drew her toward some low bushes, and there they lay down, listening to the shouts and shots that came down to them from where Tarzan fought for his life and liberty with the odds 100-to-1 against him. After a while the din ceased, and a little later the two heard the thudding of many galloping hoofs. The sound increased in volume as it drew nearer, and Danny and Jezebel tried to make themselves as small as possible beneath the little bush, in the inadequate concealment of which they were hiding. At a thundering gallop the shifters crossed the swale just above them, and all but a few had passed when one of the stragglers discovered them. His shout, which attracted the attention of others, was carried forward until it reached the new chief, and presently the entire band had circled back to learn what their fellow had discovered. Poor Gunner, poor Jezebel. Their happiness had been short-lived. Their recapture was effected with humiliating ease. Broken and dejected, they were soon on their way to the village under escort of 2 black ruffians. Bound hands and feet, they were thrown into the hut formerly occupied by Capietro, and left without food or water upon the pile of dirty rugs and clothing that littered the floor. Beside them lay the corpse of the Italian which his followers, in their haste to overtake his slayer, had not taken the time to remove. It lay upon its back, the dead eyes staring upward. Never before in his life had the spirits of Danny Patrick sunk so low, for the very reason, perhaps, that never in his life had they risen so high, as during the brief interlude of happiness he had enjoyed following his reunion with Jezebel. Now he saw no hope ahead, for with the 2 white men eliminated, he feared that he might not even be able to dicker with these ignorant black men for the ransom that he would gladly pay to free Jezebel and himself. "There goes the garage, the filling station, and the flat," he said lugubriously. "Where?" asked Jezebel. "Flooey," explained Danny. "But you are here with me," said the Golden One, "so I do not care what else there is." "That's nice, kid, but I ain't much help, all tied up like a Christmas present. They sure picked out a swell bed for me. Feels like I was lying on a piece of the kitchen stove." He rolled himself to one side and nearer Jezebel. "That's better," he said. "But I wonder what was that thing I was parked on." "Maybe your friend will come and take us away," suggested Jezebel. "Who, Smithy? What would he take us with, that dinky toy pistol of his?" "I was thinking of the other that you told me about." "Oh, that Tarzan guy. Say, kid, if he knew we was here, he'd walk in and push all these nutty dumps over with one mitt and kick the smokes over the back fence. Geez, you bet I wish he was here. There is one big shot, and I don't mean maybe." In the hut on the edge of the village was the answer to the gunner's wish, bound hand and foot, as was the gunner, and apparently equally helpless. Constantly the ape-man was working on the thongs that confined his wrists, twisting, tugging, pulling. The long day wore on, and never did the giant captive cease his efforts to escape. But the thongs were heavy and securely tied, yet little by little he felt that they were loosening. Towards evening, the new chief returned with the party that had been searching for Stawbush. They had not found him, but scouts had located the camp of Lord Passmore, and now the shifters were discussing plans for attacking it on the morrow. They had not come sufficiently close to it to note the number of armed natives it contained, but they had glimpsed Smith and Lady Barbara, and being sure that there were not more than 2 white men, they felt little hesitation in attempting the raid, since they were planning to start back for Abyssinia on the morrow. "We will kill the white man we now have," said the chief, "and carry the 2 girls and Tarzan with us. Tarzan should bring a good ransom, and the girls a good price." "Why not keep the girls for ourselves?" suggested another. "We shall sell them," said the chief. "Who are you to say what we shall do?" demanded the other. "You are no chief." "No," growled a villainous-looking black squatting beside the first objector. He who would be chief leapt cat-like upon the first speaker before any was aware of his purpose. A sword gleamed for an instant in the light of the new-made cook-fires and fell with terrific force upon the skull of the victim. "Who am I?" repeated the killer as he wiped the bloody blade upon the garment of the slain man. "I am chief." He looked around upon the scowling faces about him. "Is there any who says I am not chief?" There was no demur. Untali was chief of the Shifta band. Inside the dark interior of the hut, where he had lain bound all day without food or water, the ape-man tugged and pulled until the sweat stood in beads upon his body, but not in vain. Gradually, a hand slipped through the stretched thong, and he was free. Or at least his hands were, and it took but a moment to loosen the bonds that secured his ankles. With a low, inaudible growl, he rose to his feet and stepped to the doorway. Before him lay the village compound. He saw the Shifta squatting about while slaves prepared the evening meal. Nearby was the palisade. They must see him as he crossed to it, but what matter? He would be gone before they could gather their wits. Perhaps a few stray shots would be fired, but then, had they not fired many shots at him this morning, not one of which had touched him? He stepped out into the open, and at the same instant a burly black stepped from the next hut and saw him. With a shout of warning to his fellows, the man leapt upon the escaping prisoner. Those at the fires sprang to their feet and came running toward the 2. Within their prison hut, Jezebel and Danny heard the commotion and wondered. The ape-man seized the black who would have stopped him, and wheeling him about to form a shield for himself, backed quickly toward the palisade. "Stay where you are," he called to the advancing Shiftas in their own dialect. "Stay where you are, or I will kill this man." "Let him kill him then," growled Ntale. "He is not worth the ransom we are losing." And with a shout of encouragement to his followers, he leapt quickly forward to intercept the ape-man. Tarzan was already near the palisade as Ntale charged. He raised the struggling black above his head and hurled him upon the advancing chief, and as the 2 went down, he wheeled and ran for the palisade. Like Manu the monkey, he scaled the high barrier. A few scattered shots followed him, but he dropped to the ground outside unscathed and disappeared in the growing gloom of the advancing night. The long night of their captivity dragged on, and still the gunner and Jezebel lay as they had been left, without food or drink, while the silent corpse of Capietro stared at the ceiling. "I wouldn't treat nobody like this," said the gunner, "not even a rat." Jezebel raised herself to one elbow. "Why not try it?" she whispered. "What?" demanded Danny. "I'd try anything once." "What you said about a rat made me think of it," said Jezebel. "We have lots of rats in the land of Midian. Sometimes we catch them. They are very good to eat. We make traps, but if we do not kill the rats soon after they are caught, they gnaw their way to freedom. They gnaw the cords which bind the traps together." "Well, what of it?" demanded Danny. "We ain't got no rats, and if we had, well, I won't say I wouldn't eat 'em, kid, but I don't see what it's got to do with the mess we're in." "We're like the rats, Danny," she said. "Don't you see? We're like the rats, and we can gnaw our way to freedom." "Well, kid, said Danny. "If you want to gnaw your way through the side of this hut, hop to it. But if I gets a chance to duck, I'm going through the door." "You do not understand, Danny," insisted Jezebel. "You're an egg that cannot talk. I mean that I can gnaw the cords that fasten your wrists together."
"Geez, kid," exclaimed Danny, "dumb ain't no name for it, and I always thought I was the bright little boy. You sure got a bean, and I don't mean maybe."
"I wish I knew what you were talking about, Danny," said Jezebel, "and I wish you would let me try to gnaw the cords from your wrist. Can't you understand what I am talking about?"
"Sure, kid, but I'll do the gnawing. My jaws are tougher. Roll over and I'll get busy. When you're free, you untie me."
Jezebel rolled over on her stomach, and Danny wriggled into position where he could reach the thong at her wrists with his teeth. He fell to work with a will, but it was soon evident to him that the job was going to be much more difficult than he had anticipated. He found, too, that he was very weak and soon tired, but though often he was forced to stop through exhaustion, he never gave up. Once, when he paused to rest, he kissed the little hands that he was trying to liberate. It was a gentle, reverent kiss, quite unlike the gunner, but then love is a strange force, and when it is aroused in the breast of a man by a clean and virtuous woman, it makes him always a little tenderer and a little better. Dawn was lifting the darkness with the hut, and still the gunner gnawed upon the thongs that it seemed would never part. Capietro lay staring at the ceiling, his dead eyes rolled upward, just as he had lain there staring through all the long hours of the night, unseeing. The shifters were stirring in the village, for this was to be a busy day. Slaves were preparing the loads of camp equipment and plunder that they were to carry toward the north. The fighting men were hastening their breakfasts, that they might look to their weapons and their horse gear before riding out on their last raid from this village, against the camp of the English hunter. Ntali the chief was eating beside the fire of his favorite wife.
"Make haste, woman," he said. "I have work to do before we ride."
"You are chief now," she reminded him. "Let others work."
"This thing I do myself," replied the black man.
"What do you that is so important that I must hasten the preparation of the morning meal?" she demanded.
"I go to kill the white man and get the girl ready for the journey," he replied. "Have food prepared for her. She must eat or she will die."
"Let her die," replied the woman.
"I do not want her around. Kill them both." "Shut thy mouth," snapped the man. "I am chief."
"If you do not kill her, I shall," said the woman. "I shall not cook for any white bitch."
The man rose. "I go to kill the man," he said. "Have breakfast for the girl when I return with her."
End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Tarzan Triumphant by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. The Waziri.
"There!"
gasped the gunner. "I am free!" exclaimed Jezebel.
"And my jaws is wore out,"
said Danny. Quickly Jezebel turned and worked upon the thongs that confined the gunner's wrists before taking the time to loose her ankles. Her fingers were quite numb, for the cords had partially cut off the circulation from her hands, and she was slow and bungling at the work. It seemed to them both that she would never be done. Had they known that Ntali had already arisen from his breakfast fire with the announcement that he was going to kill the gunner, they would have been frantic. But they did not know it, and perhaps that were better, since to Jezebel's other handicaps was not added the nervous tension that surely would have accompanied a knowledge of the truth. But at last the gunner's hands were free, and then both fell to work upon the cords that secured their ankles, which were less tightly fastened. At last the gunner arose.
"The first thing I do," he said, "is to find out what I was lying on yesterday. It had a familiar feel to it, and if I'm right, boy—"
He rummaged among the filthy rags at the end of the hut, and a moment later straightened up with a Thompson submachine gun in one hand and his revolver belt and holster in the other, a grin on his face.
"This is the first break I've had in a long time," he said. "Everything's Jake now, sister."
"What are those things?" asked Jezebel.
"Them's the other half of Gunner Patrick," replied Danny. "Now bring on your tough smokes."
As he spoke, Ntali the chief drew aside the rug at the doorway and looked in. The interior of the hut was rather dark, and at first glance he could not make out the figures of the girl and the man standing at the far side. But silhouetted as he was against the growing morning light beyond the doorway, he was plainly visible to his intended victim, and Danny saw that the man carried a pistol ready in his hand. The gunner had already buckled his belt about him. Now he transferred the machine gun to his left hand and drew his revolver from its holster. He did these things quickly and silently, so quickly that as he fired, Ntali had not realized that his prisoners were free of their bonds, a thing he never knew, as doubtless he never heard the report of the shot that killed him. At the same instant that the gunner fired, the report of his revolver was drowned by yells and a shot from a sentry at the gate, to whom the coming day had revealed a hostile force creeping upon the village. As Danny Patrick stepped over the dead body of the chief and looked out into the village, he realized something of what had occurred. He saw men running hastily toward the village gates and scrambling to the banquette. He heard a fusillade of shots that spattered against the palisade, splintering the wood and tearing through to fill the village with a screaming, terror-stricken mob. His knowledge of such things told him that only high-powered rifles could send their projectiles through the heavy wood of the palisade. He saw the shifters on the banquette returning the fire with their antiquated muskets. He saw the slaves and prisoners cowering in a corner of the village that was freer from the fire of the attackers than other portions. He wondered who the enemies of the shifters might be, and past experience suggested only two possibilities, either a rival gang or the police.
"I never thought I'd come to it, kid," he said.
"Come to what, Danny?"
"I hate to tell you what I've been hoping," he admitted.
"Tell me, Danny," she said. "I won't be angry."
"I've been hoping them guys out there was cops. Just think of that, kid. Me, Gunner Patrick, a-hoping the cops would come."
"What are cops, Danny?"
"Laws, harness bulls. Geez, kid, why do you ask so many questions? Cops is cops. And I'll tell you why I hope it's them. If it ain't cops, it's a rival mob, and we get just as tough a break with them as with these guys."
He stepped out into the village street.
"Well," he said, "here goes Danny Patrick smearing up with the police. You stay here, kid, and lie down on your breadbasket, so none of them slugs'll find you while I go out and push the smokes around."
Before the gate was a great crowd of shifters firing through openings at the enemy beyond. The gunner knelt and raised the machine gun to his shoulder. There was the vicious brrr as of some titanic rattlesnake, and a dozen of the massed shifters collapsed, dead or screaming, to the ground. The others turned and, seeing the gunner, realized that they were caught between two fires, for they remembered the recent occasion upon which they had witnessed the deadly effects of this terrifying weapon. The gunner spied Oganyo among the prisoners and slaves huddled not far from where he stood, and the sight of him suggested an idea to the white man.
"Hey, Big Smoke, you!"
He waved his hand to Oganyo.
"Come here. Bring all them guys with you. Tell 'em to grab anything they can fight with if they want to make their getaway."
Whether or not Oganyo understood even a small part of what the gunner said, he seemed at least to grasp the main idea, and presently the whole mob of prisoners and slaves, except the women, had placed themselves behind Danny. The firing from the attacking force had subsided somewhat since Danny's typewriter had spoken, as though the leader of that other party had recognized its voice and guessed that white prisoners within the village might be menaced by his rifle fire. Only an occasional shot aimed at some specific target was coming into the village. The shifters had regained their composure to some extent and were preparing their horses and mounting, with the evident intention of executing a sortie. They were leaderless and confused, half a dozen shouting advice and instructions at the same time. It was at this moment that Danny advanced upon them with his motley horde armed with sticks and stones, an occasional knife, and a few swords hastily stolen from the huts of their captors. As the shifters realized that they were menaced thus seriously from the rear, the gunner opened fire upon them for the second time, and the confusion that followed in the village compound gave the attackers both within and without a new advantage. The shifters fought among themselves for the loose horses that were now stampeding in terror about the village, and as a number of them succeeded in mounting, they rode for the village gates, overthrowing those who had remained to defend them. Some among them forced the portals open, and as the horsemen dashed out, they were met by a band of black warriors, above whose heads waved white plumes, and in whose hands were modern high-powered rifles. The attacking force had been lying partially concealed behind a low ridge, and as it rose to meet the escaping shifters, the savage war cry of the Waziri rang above the tumult of the battle. First to the gates was Tarzan, war chief of the Waziri, and while Muviro and a small detachment accounted for all but a few of the horsemen who had succeeded in leaving the village, the ape-man, with the remaining Waziri, charged the demoralized remnants of Capietro's band that remained within the palisade. Surrounded by enemies, the shifters threw down their rifles and begged for mercy, and soon they were herded into a corner of the village under guard of a detachment of the Waziri. As Tarzan greeted the gunner and Jezebel, he expressed his relief at finding them unharmed. "You sure come at the right time," Danny told him. "This old typewriter certainly chews up the ammunition, and that last burst just about emptied the drum. But say, who are your friends? Where did you raise this mob?" "They are my people," replied Tarzan. "Some gang," ejaculated the gunner admiringly. "But say, have you seen anything of old Smithy?" "He is safe at my camp." "And Barbara?" asked Jezebel. "Where is she?" "She is with Smith," replied Tarzan. "You will see them both in a few hours. We start back as soon as I arrange for the disposal of these people." He turned away and commenced to make inquiries among the prisoners of the shifters. "Is he not beautiful?" exclaimed Jezebel. "Hey, sister, can that beautiful stuff," warned the gunner. "And from now on, remember that I'm the only beautiful guy you know, no matter what my pan looks like." Quickly, Tarzan separated the prisoners according to their tribes and villages, appointed headmen to lead them back to their homes, and issued instructions to them as he explained his plans. The weapons, ammunition, loot, and belongings of the shifters were divided among the prisoners, after the Waziri had been allowed to select such trifles as they desired. The captured shifters were placed in charge of a large band of Galas, with orders to return them to Abyssinia and turn them over to the nearest Ras. "Why not hang them here?" asked the Gala headman. "We shall then save all the food they would eat on the long march back to our country, besides saving us much trouble and worry in guarding them, for the Ras will certainly hang them." "Take them back as I tell you," replied Tarzan, "but if they give you trouble, do with them as you see fit." It took little more than an hour to evacuate the village. All of Smith's loads were recovered, including Danny's precious ammunition and extra drums for his beloved Thompson, and these were assigned to Smith's porters, who were once again assembled under Oganyo. When the village was emptied, it was fired in a dozen places, and as the black smoke curled up toward the blue heavens, the various parties took their respective ways from the scene of their captivity, but not before the several headmen had come and knelt before the Lord of the Jungle and thanked him for the deliverance of their people. End of Chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Tarzan Triumphant by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. The Last Knot is Tied. Lafayette Smith and Lady Barbara had been mystified witnesses to the sudden transformation of the peaceful scene in the camp of Lord Passmore. All day the warriors had remained in readiness, as though expecting a summons, and when night fell they still waited, Evidences of restlessness were apparent, and there was no singing and little laughter in the camp as there had been before. The last that the two whites saw, as they retired for the night, were the little groups of plumed warriors squatting about their fires, their rifles ready to their hands, and they were asleep when the summons came, and the sleek, black fighting men melted silently into the dark shadows of the forest, leaving only 4 of their number to guard the camp and the 2 guests. When Lady Barbara emerged from her tent in the morning, she was astonished to find the camp all but deserted. The boy who acted in the capacity of personal servant and cook for her and Smith was there, and 3 other blacks. All were constantly armed, but their attitude toward her had not changed, and she felt only curiosity relative to the other altered conditions, so obvious at first glance, rather than apprehension. When Smith joined her a few minutes later, he was equally at a loss to understand the strange metamorphosis that had transformed the laughing, joking porters and askaris into painted warriors, and sent them out into the night so surreptitiously, nor could they glean the slightest information from their boy, who, though still courteous and smiling, seemed by some strange trick of fate suddenly to have forgotten the very fair command of English that he had exhibited with evident pride on the previous day. The long day dragged on until mid-afternoon without sign of any change. Neither Lord Passmore nor the missing blacks returned, and the enigma was as baffling as before. The 2 whites, however, seemed to find much pleasure in one another's company, and so perhaps the day passed more rapidly for them than it did for the 4 blacks, waiting and listening through the hot, drowsy hours. But suddenly there was a change. Lady Barbara saw her boy rise and stand in an attitude of eager listening. "They come," he said, in his own tongue to his companions. Now they all stood, and though they may have expected only friends, their rifles were in readiness for enemies. Gradually the sound of voices and of marching men became distinctly audible to the untrained ears of the 2 whites, and a little later they saw the head of a column filing through the forest toward them. "Why, there's the gunner!" exclaimed Lafayette Smith. "And Jezebel, too! How odd that they should be together!" "With Tarzan of the Apes!" cried Lady Barbara. "He has saved them both!" A slow smile touched the lips of the ape-man as he witnessed the reunion of Lady Barbara and Jezebel, and that between Smith and Gunner, and it broadened a little when, after the first burst of greetings and explanations, Lady Barbara said, "It is unfortunate that our host, Lord Passmore, isn't here." "He is," said the ape-man. "Where?" demanded Lafayette Smith, looking about the camp. "I am Lord Passmore," said Tarzan. "You?" exclaimed Lady Barbara. "Yes. I assumed this role when I came north to investigate the rumors I had heard concerning Capietro and his band, believing that they not only would suspect no danger, but hoping also that they would seek to attack and plunder my safari as they had those of others." "Geez," said the gunner, "what a jolt they would have got." "That is why we never saw Lord Passmore," said Lady Barbara, laughing. "I thought him a most elusive host." "The first night I left you here," explained Tarzan, "I walked into the jungle until I was out of sight, and then I came back from another direction and entered my tent from the rear. I slept there all night. The next morning, early, I left in search of your friends and was captured myself. But everything has worked out well, and if you have no other immediate plans, I hope that you will accompany me back to my home and remain a while as my guests while you recover from the rather rough experiences Africa has afforded you. Or perhaps," he added, "Professor Smith and his friend wish to continue their geological investigations." Well, you see," stammered Lafayette Smith, "I have about decided to abandon my work in Africa and devote my life to the geology of England. You see, Lady Barbara, I am going to take him back to England and teach him to shoot before I let him return to Africa. Possibly we shall come back later, though. "And you, Patrick?" asked Tarzan. "Are you remaining to hunt, perhaps?"
"Nix, mister," said Danny emphatically. "We're going to California and buy a garage and filling station."
"We?" queried Lady Barbara.
"Sure," said the gunner. "Me and Jez."
"Really?" exclaimed Lady Barbara. "Is he in earnest, Jezebel?" "Oh, kid, isn't it ripping?" replied the Golden One. End of chapter 26. The End of Tarzan Triumphant by Edgar Rice Burroughs.